I have stood on the Finnish border with Russia. Not on a map, physically, in the winter, in a place called Imatra in southeastern Finland, where a river runs between two countries, and the tree line on the Russian side looks identical to the tree line on the Finnish side. And yet, the two worlds it separates could not be more different. I stood there in the snow and thought about something a Finnish army officer told me over coffee the night before. He said, "We have always known this day was coming. We just didn't know what shape it would arrive in." I did not fully understand what he meant then. I understand it now, because in the last 72 hours, something has shifted in the Baltic that most people have not yet registered. Russia just challenged Finland, and in doing so, Putin sealed a cage around his own nuclear fleet that he may never be able to reopen. Let me show you exactly how that cage was built and why the man who thought he was rattling the bars is actually standing inside them. To understand what just happened, you need to understand the geography, because in geopolitics, geography is not background, geography is destiny. The Russian Baltic Fleet, one of the four main fleets of the Russian Navy, based at Baltisk in Kaliningrad and at the Kronstadt naval base just outside St. Petersburg, has exactly one way in and one way out of the Baltic Sea. One. That exit is a narrow passage called the Danish Straits, a series of channels between Denmark and Sweden that connects the Baltic to the North Sea and from there to the Atlantic Ocean. Those straits are at their narrowest approximately 17 kilometers wide. 17! To put that in perspective, that is narrower than the English Channel at Dover. That is a gap that modern naval mines, coastal missile batteries, and submarine-laid obstacles can close in hours. And every single country lining those straits, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, is now a full NATO member. With Finland and Sweden inside NATO, the entire Baltic Sea is now effectively a NATO lake. Russia's Baltic Fleet is not operating in contested waters. It is operating in a body of water almost entirely surrounded by hostile alliance territory. The cage was not built overnight. It was built piece by piece over 2 years while Moscow was focused on Ukraine, and Putin helped build it himself. The Gulf of Finland, the narrow arm of the Baltic Sea that connects St. Petersburg to the wider world, serves as Russia's key maritime corridor through which 60% of Russia's seaborne oil exports travel. 400 or more vessels per week, oil tankers, cargo ships, the vessels of Russia's shadow fleet, all of them threading through a waterway that is at its narrowest point, flanked on the north by Finland and on the south by Estonia. Both of them NATO members. Both of them with military plans, confirmed publicly by Estonian Defense Forces Commander Major General Andrus Murillo to close the Gulf of Finland completely to Russian ships in a time of threat. He did not say this quietly or in a classified briefing. He said it on the record. Militarily, this is feasible. We are prepared for it, and we are moving in that direction. That statement was not a bluff. Finland and Estonia have been wargaming exactly this scenario for 18 months. The mines exist, the coastal defense batteries exist, the joint naval patrol protocols exist. The only thing that has prevented implementation is the political decision to pull the trigger. And Russia, with its latest challenge to Finnish sovereignty, just handed Helsinki the political justification it has been waiting for. Here is what Russia did. And this matters, because it was not a single dramatic act, it was a pattern, a campaign. The kind of thing that when you see each incident in isolation, looks like an unfortunate accident or a minor provocation. But when you lay them all on a timeline, the picture is unmistakable. On December 25, 2024, the Estlink 2 undersea power cable connecting Finland and Estonia was cut, along with 4 telecommunications lines, on the same day, by what Finnish and Estonian investigators concluded was a Russian-linked vessel dragging its anchor across the seabed. On December 31, 2025, Finnish authorities seized the cargo vessel Fitberg, crewed by Russians, en route from St. Petersburg to Haifa, suspected of deliberately damaging a subsea telecommunications cable linking Helsinki and Tallinn. The ship was carrying sanctioned Russian steel, Its anchor chain had been lowered into the water and dragged along the seabed for, according to Finnish police, at least several tens of kilometers before striking the cable. In January 2026, an undersea fiber optic cable between Latvia and Sweden was severed. In February 2026, Russian MiG-31 fighter jets violated Estonian airspace over the island of Vaindloo, a 15-acre rocky outcrop at a strategic choke point in the Gulf of Finland, remaining inside NATO airspace for 12 minutes and traveling nearly 125 miles west before being intercepted by Italian, Swedish, and Finnish jets. Estonia called it unprecedentedly brazen. NATO triggered Article 4 consultations. Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov responded by saying that NATO shooting down an intruding Russian manned aircraft would constitute an act of war. Finland's Defense Minister Antti Häkkänen described Russia's strategy with precision. It looks completely legal or innocent at first, but in reality achieves the effect that is wanted, namely destabilization, chaos, even harming national defense. He was speaking specifically about Russian-owned properties near Finnish military bases, thousands of properties purchased by Russian investors over decades, including 14 near the strategically critical Åland Islands and subsea cables acquired by a single Russian-linked company, properties with reinforced concrete docks and helicopter landing pads on tourist islands, properties sitting directly across the harbor from Finland's most critical port, 35 kilometers from Finland's only oil refinery, 20 kilometers from Helsinki-Vantaa Airport. When military tensions begin to rise, networks are cut, strange things start happening on properties, and acts of sabotage occur. It is already too late to start closing the gaps. Finland heard that warning, and Finland acted. Helsinki hosted a summit of NATO states bordering the Baltic Sea in January, launching Operation Baltic Sentry, a multi-domain NATO operation deploying naval vessels, surveillance aircraft, and underwater drone systems to protect critical undersea infrastructure. NATO's Task Force X began deploying cutting-edge robotic systems and AI-assisted seabed scanning technology across the Baltic floor. Insurance documents of suspected Shadow Fleet ships can now be checked and acted upon by 12 European NATO states, including all Baltic Nordic countries, Poland, Germany, and the UK. Finland's border with Russia, all 1,340 kilometers of it, has been closed to all cross-border traffic indefinitely, and Finland, which even as a neutral country maintained the strongest artillery force in Europe and the ability to mobilize 280,000 soldiers within days, has now raised that ceiling to 1 million. 1 million highly motivated Finns available to defend their country. Put yourself in the position of a Russian Baltic Fleet admiral sitting in Baltisk right now, reading these developments in sequence. Your fleet's home port in Kaliningrad is an exclave, a piece of Russian territory completely surrounded by NATO members, Poland and Lithuania, with no land connection to Russia itself. Your secondary base at Kronstad sits at the eastern tip of the Gulf of Finland, a waterway that Finland and Estonia have publicly stated they can close. The Danish Straits, your only exit to the Atlantic, are flanked by NATO members on both shores. An estimated 80,000 Russian troops are being repositioned near Finland, but those troops cannot sail. They cannot unjoin Sweden and Finland from NATO. They cannot unbuild the coastal missile batteries that now cover every nautical mile of water your fleet would need to traverse to reach the open ocean. Your nuclear-capable submarines, your surface combatants, your amphibious assault vessels are all sitting in a body of water that, in the event of a conflict, becomes the world's most dangerous bathtub, deep enough to hide in, not deep enough to escape from. The ice has made everything worse. This winter, the Gulf of Finland is more than 80% frozen, the harshest winter since 2010-2011. Russia's key oil export ports at Primorsk and Vyazovsk have been forced to restrict entry to ships without ice-class designation. Russia's oil exports through Primorsk have fallen by more than 30% compared to 2025 and 50% compared to 2024. The Shadow Fleet, those hundreds of rusting, poorly maintained tankers that Russia depends on to export the oil revenue that funds the war in Ukraine, is being strangled.
New US and British sanctions adopted in January have stopped dozens of ships in their tracks. Chinese and Indian ports are refusing them entry. The revenue stream that keeps Putin's war machine operational is bleeding from the Baltic end, at the same moment the Iran crisis is threatening it from the Hormuz end. Two choke points, one economy, and both are being tightened simultaneously. Here is the historical parallel that every American watching this needs to understand, because Americans have seen this movie before. In 1941 and 1942, Imperial Japan controlled the largest contiguous empire in Asia. It had the most powerful naval air force in the world. It had momentum, initiative, and a strategic theory that said America would tire of the fight before Japan ran out of resources. What Japan did not adequately account for was the geography of its own empire. Every oil tanker Japan needed to fuel its war machine had to travel through narrow
sea lanes in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, lanes that American submarines systematically began destroying. By 1944, Japan's oil imports had collapsed by 60%. Its aircraft carriers could not sail because they had no fuel. Its ground forces on Pacific Islands were left to starve because the supply ships could not reach them. Japan had not lost a single home island battle, but it had lost the war in the sea lanes, because an empire that cannot move its resources is not an empire. It is a very large, very expensive prison. Russia is staring at the same arithmetic in the Baltic. 60% of Russia's seaborne oil exports travel through the Gulf of Finland and the Danish Straits. If those exports are cut by ice, by sanctions, by Finnish and Estonian naval action, by NATO interdiction of the Shadow Fleet, the revenue that funds 350,000 Russian soldiers currently deployed across the Ukrainian front begins to dry up. Not immediately, not in weeks, but in months. And Putin knows this, which is why the provocations, the cable cutting, the airspace violations, the Russian properties near NATO military bases, the Shadow Fleet operations are not random. They are not the work of reckless subordinates acting without Kremlin authorization. They are a campaign designed to intimidate Finland and Estonia into restraint, to make NATO blink before it tightens the noose, to preserve the one economic lifeline that Russia has left in the north. And Finland is not blinking. NATO's Cold Response 26 winter warfare exercise involving 25,000 troops concluded in January 2026, and Finnish officials immediately began calling for increased urgency and numbers. Finnish territory has been transformed into what defense analysts describe as a formidable bastion on NATO's northern flank. American cruise missiles can now legally overfly Swedish territory and strike targets inside Russia. NATO forces are positioned closer to critical Russian military infrastructure than at any point since the Cold War ended. St. Petersburg, Russia's second-largest city and the home port of the Baltic Fleet, sits 250 miles from the Finnish border. Tanks positioned at that border could reach the city in as little as 6 hours on open roads. The current geopolitical situation for St. Petersburg is described by NATO analysts as reminiscent of the siege of Leningrad in 1941. That is not an exaggeration written for effect. That is the operational reality that Russian military planners are now working with every single day. The Finnish officer I met at the border in Imatra told me something else that night over coffee. He said that Finland had spent 50 years after the Winter War of 1939 being careful, diplomatic, measured, refusing to provoke the bear next door. He said that careful and measured had kept Finland safe, but it had not kept Finland free. Not completely, not in the way that a country surrounded by the shadow of a nuclear neighbor can ever be completely free. And then he looked at me and said, "Now we are in NATO. Now the bear has a problem it has never had before. Not just us, all of us, together." He raised his coffee cup, and I understood then what he meant. The cage was already being built. Russia's provocations against Finland did not delay that cage, they accelerated it. Every cut cable, every violated airspace,
Every Shadow Fleet tanker seized in Finnish waters is another bar welded into place, not by Finland alone, by an alliance of 32 nations who have collectively decided that the bear's reach ends here. Putin's nuclear fleet sits in the Baltic. It can maneuver, it can train, it can project the appearance of capability, but it cannot break out, not without fighting through 17 kilometers of Danish straits flanked by NATO, not without fighting through a Gulf of Finland that Finland and Estonia can close in hours, not without fighting an alliance that, for the first time in the history of the Russian state, completely surrounds the sea that Russia's founders called their window onto Europe. Peter the Great built St. Petersburg to give Russia that window. He would not recognize what the view looks like from the other direction in 2026. The cage is real. The cage is closing, and the creature inside it just rattled the bars loud enough for all of Europe to hear. So, tell us, do you believe Putin escalates further against Finland, or does the reality of the Baltic cage force Moscow to recalculate? That is the question that 32 NATO defense ministries are analyzing right now. Leave your answer in the comments below. Share this with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening in the north. Subscribe to this channel, because the next move in the Baltic will come before most people expect it, and we will be here when it does. Thank you for watching.